Before 1919, Hitler's life up to then had been one of failure. He'd failed to get into the art academy in Vienna, where he'd gone and tried to pass the exam to get into the art academy. He wanted to be an artist. He then squandered all the money that he'd inherited and ended up basically as a tramp in Vienna, living in hostels. He had no career in mind and he had no qualifications, so his life probably would have been a continued one of drifting through the beer halls of Munich and the cafes, trying to sell his paintings, which were paintings of street scenes of Munich and earlier of Vienna, making a little bit of money to eke by a living in, but nothing more. Then the war came, and the war for him was he felt it to be a salvation. Now he got a cause that he wanted to fight for. Hitler in 1915 already had a sort of ideological motivation in this war, which was cleansing Germany of foreign elements, or how we want to describe it. And the war comes to an end, and Hitler's really, he looked back on the war as the greatest time in his life. He manages to remain within the army for quite a number of months, about another 18 months, and in that period he makes himself valuable within the army as becoming then an informant for his army unit on right-wing groups, and that's how he comes into contact with the infant Nazi Party, a very small organisation in Munich, and then gets involved in the Nazi Party and soon becomes its star speaker. That's already in his mind in 1919, at the time that his own views about the Jews are now becoming transformed into an ideology, a Weltanschauung as he puts it, which then remains with him right down to the bunker in Berlin, where he's still, at the very last moment of his life, is still blaming the Jews for the war and still saying it's the duty of Germany to effectively to remove the Jews altogether. The key moment was the defeat in 1918, and then the period that Hitler spent in Munich in the following months. He'd witnessed then the end of the war, the revolution, the end of Imperial Germany and so on. In this period of great upheaval in Munich, which culminated then in the so-called Räterepublik in April 1919, the Soviet-style government in Munich, which Hitler saw at first hand. During this period, Hitler then converted his anti-Semitism inherent within him into an ideology which he then blamed the Jews for the war, for the revolution, for everything. We can't generalize about the entire population. After all, Hitler in free elections didn't win more than a third of the vote. So 2/3 of the German people were not really receptive to this message until he got power. But there were certain things that he stood for which were attractive to a wider sector of the population than just the people who voted for the Nazi Party. His stance of wanting to remove the stain of the Versailles Treaty, this Treaty of 1919, in which the Germans felt they'd been very badly treated. This sentiment that Versailles had to be overcome and revised and replaced, and the humiliation of 1918 in the end of the war had to be surmounted by German recovery, by building up a strong Germany again. This was a feeling that went way beyond just the Nazi voters themselves. The notion that the left, the socialists, the communists, had to be excluded from a new German people's community, a Volksgemeinschaft. This too was a sentiment that went way beyond the hardcore of Nazi support. And of course also the antagonism towards the Jews was something which again stretched more widely. The hatred of Bolshevism was another thing. The German people were not ready for the hardcore of the Nazi message, except for about a third of the population who supported them by 1933, but a large sector of the rest of the population formed a type of basis of consensus for other things if Hitler were able to pull them off and to be successful. And in the following years, from their point of view, of course, he was in building Germany up, in removing unemployment, in getting the economy moving again, and so on. So in this way, then, it was possible to convert Hitler's image as a party leader into his image as a national leader, and then gain this wide base of popular support. At that time, Hitler was speaking to people who were already partially attuned to what he wanted to say. So in these beer halls, the atmosphere there was a very excitable atmosphere, with crowds in there who were, most of them were sympathetic to what he was saying, and Hitler could speak their language. So what Hitler did was to convey to them their own anger and their hatreds and their resentments in the way in which they understood. There's just one thing to add to that, which is that before 1930, the first pictures we have of Hitler speaking in public, I think, are 1932, just before he got to power. Once he was in power, of course, we have lots of film of Hitler speaking, but these are then staged occasions, and for the most part then he has a script which he can't deviate from, and we see parts of a long speech on the newsreels and so on. He himself, of course, had by then developed, for many years he'd been cultivating this image of that he was something special and different, and in the early 1930s the image of Hitler was built up by Nazi propaganda as something that was quite special, quite different. Once he was in power, then of course power itself contributed to this image of heroic leadership that was then built up by Goebbels and by the Nazi propaganda machine. So Hitler himself was an unusual individual, that's without a shadow of doubt, but the bulk of what we call his charismatic image and so on was of course a creation of propaganda. It was built up around him and cultivated by Goebbels and by the rest of the propaganda machine. Well, I took this notion of working towards the Führer from a speech by a routine speech by a Nazi functionary in 1934. His name was Werner Willikens. He's not really very important, but in the speech he said it's the duty of every German now to work towards the Führer in the way that he would wish. In other words, to anticipate what his wishes should be and to work to try to implement them. And so I think what we have here is a notion which helps to explain how that regime functioned. Hitler didn't need to give out a stream of orders all the time, say do this, do that, do the other. He stood for a certain number of unchangeable ideological imperatives. One of them was remove the Jews. What did that mean? It meant different things to different people at different times. But within that regime from 1933, it was impossible then to say, well, we don't want to remove the Jews. They're a very good thing in Germany and very good for culture and all that. So you had to seek ways in which to follow out this imperative of removal of the Jews. And so it's a link between Hitler and the workings of the regime, without Hitler having to command everything all the time, this notion of implementation of the Führer's wishes without actually waiting for an order. There were many local actions where people were confronted with violence, and that happened on a more or less daily basis, that Jews would be thrown out of a swimming pool and so on. They'd be beaten up, some Jews would be beaten up on the street. But you see in 1935 already, in the long period of the wave of anti-Semitism in 1935 that ended up with the Nuremberg laws, Jews were being attacked on the streets, and there were all sorts of reports saying this is unpopular. People don't want them to be beaten up on the streets and so on. They want the Jews to be excluded from Germany, but they don't want this public violence. So there's only one time where, across the entire country, at one single time where this confronts them, and that is in the pogrom, with the pogroms of November 1938. And later on, of course, Jews are then rounded up for deportation in different cities. But again, at different times, at different points, there's no sort of general nationwide rounding up of Jews for deportation at one moment. So I think it's right to say that there's only that one point where where Germans are outwardly, directly confronted with public violence towards the Jews. You could say if Himmler was the architect, Heydrich was the master builder, but behind that there's somebody who gives the commission, and that was Hitler. And so Hitler is absolutely indispensable to this. No Hitler, no Holocaust, I've said on a number of occasions. These other people were implementers of it, and Himmler said on several occasions that the Führer has placed on my shoulders the heavy responsibility for carrying out his task of removing the Jews. And Himmler spoke openly about this to his SS leaders and the party leaders in a way that Hitler never did and never could do in his notorious speeches in Posen in 1943. Hitler's authorization is needed for the boycott against the Jews already in 1933, for the Nuremberg laws in 1935, for the pogroms in 1938. Hitler's authorization is necessary in the war for the imposition of the Yellow Star on Jews in 1941, crucially for the deportation of the Reich Jews in the autumn of 1941, which sent the escalating steps into all-out genocide into action. And Hitler, all the way along, we see places where Hitler's authorization is necessary. Maybe the initiatives came from other people, but without Hitler, they weren't commissioned. And that's the same with this. For Himmler and Heydrich themselves were not in a position to do that without Hitler commissioning it or authorizing it. Nazi leadership, not just the immediate leadership around Hitler, but then the subordinate leadership in the regions, they had, to say, burnt their boats with Hitler. They'd all done terrible things, or they were involved in the doing of terrible things. They felt that they had nothing to lose by not fighting on. On top of that comes then the fear of the Russians in the east, and there it's plain that not just towards the Jews, but towards the Soviet population, horrendous things had happened. And therefore the German population in general, and the Nazis in particular, knew that they had nothing to gain by losing the war if the Soviets were going to occupy Germany. And then on top of that, you've got the continued, you're dealing with a very modern, efficient bureaucracy. If that had been less efficient and less modern, probably it would have collapsed earlier. But it was able to keep going, able to keep feeding the population, for example, organizing things despite all the problems. You've got a whole number of things, and at the center, you've got the figure of Hitler himself and the fact that the loyalty towards Hitler itself plays a part. Whether it's simply from the point of view of that these people, such as Bormann or Himmler, or Goebbels, they bought in their lot with Hitler. They can't easily now detach themselves from him, although one or two tried near the end. I gave in the book several examples of people who say at the end, well, the only way we can end this war is to surrender, but we can't do that because that would be to desert the Führer in his hour of need, and therefore we have to keep on fighting. For a long time, there was very little said about this in Germany. The Nazi past itself was not really a big subject of exploration for the part of ordinary Germans between the end of the war and the late 1960s. Then the student demonstrations and the wave of interest that followed the 1968 events, they created a new interest in the Nazi past, but then a lot of that was directed by issues related to Marxism, so it's the role of big business in the Third Reich and these sort of things. There still wasn't very great attention, apart from specialists, very great attention played to what was by then becoming called the Holocaust. And that only came in really in the 1980s. So it's a long time after the end of the war, 35 years or so after the end of the war, that people then start to take an interest really, I'm talking about ordinary people now, start to take an interest really in the fate of the Jews. The film called Holocaust, American film, it's a terrible film, but anyway, this American TV film came out in 1979, Here it came and went, nobody took much notice, but in Germany it was a sensation. And all at once, people then started, through this rather trite film, started to become aware of personal relationships in the Holocaust and what went on. And there was a massive outpouring of research then and of interest, in popular interest in the Holocaust in Germany. It began, if I'm not wrong, in the early 1980s, but today, public opinion today. But I have the impression, maybe wrongly, that it's a generational thing too, that if you look in the German press, the mainstream, the high-class German press, hardly a week goes by without something on the Holocaust in it. If you look at the Bild-Zeitung, it's a different matter, and ordinary people, a lot of young people, basically I think take the view, Holocaust, Hitler, Third Reich, we're up to there with it, let's move on.